On the origins of Mohammedan jurisprudence, taken from the book on the common link theory. Chapter 1, continuation. In an article published to Origins, Schacht remarked on the backward growth of Isnad as a prelude to a CLT. He wrote, I would like to mention some of the more obvious conclusions. One of these is that Snads have a tendency to grow backwards, and that after going back to, say, a successor to begin with, they are subsequently often carried to a companion, and finally to the Prophet himself. In general, we can say, the more perfect the Isnad, the later the tradition. Then he introduces the family Isnad, which he considers as a form of the CLT. And this is the family Isnad. Whenever traditions claim to add an additional guarantee by presenting themselves as transmitted amongst family members, e.g. from father to son and grandson, from aunt to nephew, or from master to freedman, it can positively be shown that these family Isnads are not a primary indication of authenticity, but only a device for securing its appearance. In other words, the existence of a family Isnad, contrary to what it pretends, is a positive indication that the tradition in question is not authentic. At the very end of the article, Schacht summarizes his theory of prophetic tradition, although it should be remembered that at this time his CLT was not formally formalized. He wrote, in the field of law, the Sunnah of the Prophet, based on formal traditions from him, developed out of the living tradition of each ancient living school of law. The common doctrine of the specialist, some of its features might of course, in the last resort, go back to an early period, but it acquired its superstructure of formal traditions from the Prophet, with proper isnads only about the middle of the second century AH. As a result of the activity of the traditionists, the imposing appearance of the isnads in the classical collections of tradition ought not to blind us to the true character of these traditions, which is that of a comparatively recent systemization of a living tradition. The same is true of the field of history. Here too, the vague collective memory of the community was formalized, systematized, replenished with details, and shaped into formal traditions with proper isnads only in the 2nd century AH. In his origins, Schacht acknowledged his work on isnads was directed at confirming Goldsmith's results, and was intended to surpass them. He wrote, a great many traditions in the classical and other collections were put into circulation only after Shafi'i's time. The first considerable body of legal traditions from the Prophet originated toward the middle of the 2nd century, in opposition to slightly earlier traditions from companions and other authorities, and to the living tradition of the ancient schools of law. Traditions from companions and other authorities underwent the same process of growth, and are to be considered in the same light as traditions from the Prophet. The study of isnads often enables us to date traditions. The isnads show a tendency to grow backwards and to claim higher and higher authority until they arrive at the Prophet. The evidence of legal traditions carries us back to about the year 100 AH only. At that time, Islamic legal thought started from late Umayyad administrative and popular practice. This is still reflected in a number of traditions. Schacht thus insists that the traditions of the Prophet did not emerge during his lifetime, but arose afterwards as innovations at the time when Islam's foundational tenets were already formed. In his origins, Schacht looks at the role of tradition in the development of legal theory, beginning with a chapter about the arguments for and against traditions, in which he moves from general to specific issues. He points to Shafi's identification of two groups of anti-traditionists, the Ahl al-Kalam or Mu'tazila, those who rejected the traditions altogether, and those who rejected the Khabar Khas. The latter group, Schacht claims, were simply the followers of the ancient schools of law. Among the many arguments brought forward against prophetic traditions, the most important for our purpose is the one that in its simplest form claims to be an isolated tradition, transmitted by a single individual. It cannot be accepted as well authenticated. Furthermore, when Schacht comes to explain the different interpretations of the term sunnah, he introduces the Iraqi definition by which Abu Yusuf opposed sunnah in the case of isolated traditions, distinguishing between what he had heard on the authority of the Prophet, the tradition athar, and the well-known, recognized sunnah, sunnah al-mahfudha al-ma'rufa. The Iraqi position towards the isolated hadith is clearly enunciated by Abu Yusuf, who said, take the traditions that are generally known, and beware of those that are irregular. Providing a firm starting point for the systematic use of traditions to document the historical development of legal doctrine was one of Schacht's vital aims. This led him to investigate the growth of legal traditions, surveying their emergence in the literary period from 150 to 250, as Goldziher had suggested. This investigation led him to distrust the Isnad as a guarantor of the authenticity of traditions, and he tried to justify this distrust on the basis of four main arguments. The first was the e silentio, suggesting the best way of proving that a tradition did not exist at a certain time is to show that it was not used as a legal argument in a discussion that would have made reference to it imperative if it had existed. The second argument was the backward growth of Isnad, according to which doctrines were frequently projected back to higher authorities, i.e., traditions from successors became traditions from companions, and traditions from companions became traditions from the Prophet. The third was the family Isnad, which is the practical example of the process of backward growth. The fourth and most crucial argument, deriving from but also serving as evidence for the previous argument, is the CLT, described by Schacht as follows. The results regarding the growth of Isnads enable us to envisage the case in which a tradition was put into circulation by a traditionist whom we may call NN, or by a person who used his name at a certain time. The tradition would normally be taken over by one or several transmitters, and the lower raw part of the Isnad would branch out into several strands. The original promoter NN would have provided this tradition with an Isnad reaching back to an authority such as a companion or the Prophet, and this higher fictitious part of the Isnad would often acquire additional branches by the creation of improvements which would take their place beside the original chain of transmitters, or by the process which we have described as spread of Snads. But NN would remain the lowest link in the several strands of the Isnad, or at least in most of them, allowing for this being passed by and eliminated in additional strands of Isnad, which might have been introduced later. Whether this happens to the lower or to the higher part of the Isnad, or to both, the existence of a significant common link NN in all of our Isnads of a given tradition would be a strong indication in favour of it having originated in the time of NN. The same conclusion would have been drawn when Isnads of different but closely connected traditions showed a common link. This argument is intended to reveal the structure of the backward growth of Isnad, and is used by Schacht as a tool to determine when the tradition was fabricated. Surprisingly, Schacht proclaims that the common link is a feature found in almost all of the legal traditions, and yet fails to consider seriously the arguments or even terminology used by Tirmidhi, whom he nevertheless quotes. According to Schacht, the case discussed in the previous paragraph regarding the common link theory is not a hypothetic but of common occurrence. It was observed though of course not recognized in its implications by the Mohammedan scholars themselves. For instance, by Tirmidhi in the concluding chapter of his collection of traditions. He calls traditions with NN as a common link in their Isnads. The traditions of NN, and they form a great part of the traditions which he calls gharib, that is transmitted by a single transmitter at one stage of the Isnad. In order to eliminate roughly the traditions as they were narrated through the NN, we must first compile statistics on the basis of a Tirmidhi's collection and other Hadith collections. A similar study of the Hadith terminology used by Tirmidhi and other traditionists is another prerequisite. Schacht's fourth argument relates to the spread of Isnads. He says, parallel with the improvement and backward growth of Isnads goes their spread, but this is the creation of additional authorities or transmitters for the same doctrine or tradition. The spread of Snads was intended to meet the objection which was used to make isolated traditions. Michael Cook accepts this reasoning and adds, we should not be put off by the existence of one or two variant Isnads that bypass the common link, the result of a wider process termed by Schacht the spread of Isnad. The common theory helps, according to Schacht, to determine the date when each tradition originated. Schacht states, the existence of common transmitters enables us to affirm a firm date of many traditions, and to the doctrines represented by them. This consideration, which takes into account the fictitious character of the higher parts of Isnad, must replace the uncritical acceptance of the face value of Isnads as far back as the time of the companions. We must of course always reckon with the possibility that the name of a common transmitter was used by an anonymous person's, so that its occurrence gives only a terminus a quo. This applies particularly to the period of successors.